You're watching VinylicPumaGaming. What's up guys, back with another video, and today I figured we could do another commentary discussing Fallout 4, as well as the Fallout universe, and how society never really seems to progress throughout the wasteland. Now, before we get into this video, there was a great video that was recently made by the Game Theorists discussing why Fallout 4 society is doomed. To simplify their point, the Game Theorists point out that psychological problems caused by radiation are preventing the wasteland from progressing the way that it should. Overall, it's a great video, and if you do want to check it out, I'll go ahead and I'll leave a link to that video in the description. I think this is an interesting topic to discuss, as I would say that the society in Fallout progressed between the very first game and Fallout 2, however, it ultimately regressed with Fallout 3, New Vegas, and perhaps even Fallout 4 as well. As I understand it, the very first Fallout game mostly consisted of small towns that were under constant threat from various sources. These threats can include everything from raiders to super mutants to deathclaws or whatever else you can think of. And as far as their economy was concerned, everyone in the wasteland wanted water, and instead of carrying vast amounts of water to places, which was both very heavy and very difficult to transport, traders decided to exchange bottle caps, which became the currency of the wasteland. Now, the idea was that bottle caps were both scarce and difficult to counterfeit, as you needed the proper materials to do so. However, if you fast forward roughly 80 years later to the events of Fallout 2, we discover that many of these small towns coalesced into a single government known as the NCR, or New California Republic. The New California Republic no longer relies on bottle caps for trade, and instead has created their own currency known as the NCR dollar. In a certain sense, the NCR in Fallout 2 is portrayed kind of like the United States was before the war, complete with its own system of government and its own military. In fact, we even know that the NCR has laws that prevent the persecution and discrimination of individuals based on their gender or ethnicity. There are also anti-slavery laws, and certain things like gambling and prostitution aren't allowed within major population centers. Granted, these laws aren't enforced quite as much in outside territories where you can occasionally see things like slavery and the massacre of super mutants and ghouls. At the end of the day, the NCR portrayed in Fallout 2 makes it seem like the world is starting to slowly recover from the nuclear war that devastated it almost 150 years prior. However, as I mentioned earlier, things seem to really regress with Fallout 3. The first glaring thing that you'll notice in Fallout 3 is that instead of using NCR dollars or using some kind of East Coast equivalent, we're back to using bottle caps. While we can assume that bottle caps are backed by water like they are in the very first game, this isn't ever really confirmed in the game at all. You may also discover that the Capital Wasteland is in a similar situation to what we witnessed in Fallout 1, and it mostly consists of small towns or groups of people trying to survive the everyday threats that include things like raiders, super mutants, and deathclaws. While there was a genuine attempt to improve their circumstances with Project Purity, the first attempt by James's wife Catherine, Dr. Lee, and Elder Lyon's Brotherhood of Steel failed because they couldn't maintain control of downtown DC. Thus, the setting of the game is essentially a post-apocalyptic wasteland where the player tries to reactivate Project Purity in the hopes of restoring some kind of civilization. Fallout 4's setting is somewhat similar to Fallout 3's, but with some interesting variation. You wake up after being frozen for 200 years to discover that the world you once knew has devolved into a wasteland. But ultimately, like Fallout 3 and Fallout 1, most villagers reside within towns like Diamond City and Goodneighbor, and use bottle caps for currency. The people of the Commonwealth are under constant threat from super mutants and raiders, and in Diamond City in particular, ghouls are prevented from being within city limits, which is in stark contrast to what you might have seen in Fallout 2's NCR. If you ask me, the number one reason that we don't really see society progress in Fallout is simply because if it did, it might not be a Fallout game anymore. Granted, Fallout 2 showed society progressing and becoming more like the pre-war United States. However, Fallout 3 ultimately went back to how things were in Fallout 1. Subsequent games, including New Vegas to a certain extent, are set in areas where the rule of law is limited or non-existent, and everyone trades bottle caps as currency. I would say that to a certain extent, the people that enjoy Fallout probably like how the franchise stays in this state of perpetual stagnation, and from a game design perspective, wouldn't it be more interesting to get thrown into the post-apocalypse, find other people, and then attempt to rebuild society from the ground up? Or would you rather preserve an existing society by protecting it from raiders, super mutants, and deathclaws? Between the two, I would say that the former is a little bit more interesting. In a certain sense, I would say that rebuilding society, or the process of starting to rebuild society, is what Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 are about. The difference between Fallout 4 and 3 is that in Fallout 4, you could choose to be more active in the rebuilding process by siding with the Minutemen to build settlements. The point of building settlements is so that the player can help restore or bring some semblance of civilization to the wasteland. In fact, you could argue that your actions in Fallout 4 might lead to the establishment of a form of government in the future, complete with its own military in the form of the Minutemen, and its economy being based around water and food production from the settlers. All they really need now is some form of governing body, which would probably develop sometime after the events of Fallout 3 and, more importantly, Fallout 4 conclude. So you could say that, in a sense, that Fallout is about the player character being introduced to the wasteland and eventually reshaping it into a better place. Or, alternatively, you could choose to reduce the wasteland into further ruin and decay. In Fallout 3, you can infect Project Purity with a mutated version of FEV that ultimately kills everyone. Or in New Vegas, you can choose to help the Legion gain control over the Mojave and force its citizens into slave labor, among other things. While it wasn't included in Fallout 4's base game, the Nuka World DLC allows you to join the raiders and take control of each settlement in the Commonwealth one by one, while enslaving the entire local population. I think the important question now is what all of this says for future iterations in the franchise. Will we get a game more like Fallout 2, where we return to some of the locations from a previous game to notice how much more of that area has been developed over time? Or will we get new Fallout games in brand new areas that ultimately just consist of the same overarching idea that we've seen in all of the Fallout games since Fallout 3, where the player character's goal is to reestablish society in a given region? My bet is on the latter in this case, simply because it's a lot easier to design a similar game in a brand new area with new features, as opposed to designing a game that elaborates upon a previous game. If another Fallout game came out that was more like Fallout 2, where we saw how people reclaimed the wasteland over time, you would have to show how society progressed over time, or how your actions in the previous game affect your actions in the game's sequel. While all of the Fallout games have endings that have ultimately become the canon ending, like how Project Purity was activated in Fallout 3 based on some dialogue from Deacon in Fallout 4, to make a true sequel that elaborates on what happened in the previous iteration, we would need some way for the player's choices in the previous game to affect the game's sequel. Now, you're probably thinking about Mass Effect here, where your decisions in Mass Effect 1 would affect how some aspects of the plot were affected in Mass Effect 2 and 3. For example, maybe you chose Ashley Williams in the first game, so Kaiden Alenko can't appear in later Mass Effect games since he died on Vermeer. For a Fallout game more like Fallout 2 was to Fallout 1, you would have to account for at least 100 choices that the player made during the first game. If this was applied to the most recent game, Fallout 4, you would have to account for what faction you sided with, what characters you had affinity with, and how you completed some of the game's various side quests, both from and excluding some of the DLC. Even if Fallout 4's sequel ultimately went with a different protagonist or player character, the game's sequel would have to reflect on choices that the player made in the previous game. Or at the very least, it would greatly improve Fallout 4's sequel if they did. This could actually be a pretty cool idea for the very next Fallout game. Having your choices from the previous Fallout game affect the next game in the series would be awesome. Imagine the differences between allowing the Minutemen to flourish in Fallout 4 versus allowing the Nuka World Raiders to flourish in Fallout 4. Maybe in one instance, the Minutemen are able to establish a system of government, and this has effects on the surrounding region. Or maybe if the Nuka World Raiders are successful, the Commonwealth has descended into further decay, slavery is everywhere, and things are just pretty bad. I think the most interesting thing here would be the differences between all four of the endings. If the Institute survives, do they have synths stationed everywhere in the next game? Or if the Brotherhood wins, do they establish a military base and improve the technology in the region? Ultimately, I think a game in the Fallout universe that's more like Fallout 2 would be a fresh change of pace, and I'd ultimately be curious to see how Bethesda would implement this into the next game. Until then, I think we're going to see more Fallout games in new locations where society has mostly experienced only limited progression. I think this is a shame, since it seems like Bethesda could do some other really interesting things with the franchise. Alright guys, that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, please be sure to leave a like, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care and I'll see you all next time.